Hello again. Can people hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. So I'm not sure if the slide presentation is up, but while we're waiting for it to come up, just a few things just some housekeeping items for me. As far as disclosures go, my salary is supported by NINDS/NIH via the NET award, and the grant numbers there listed on our slides. Aside from salary support, I have no other conflicts or financial interest to report. The content of my presentation was developed by me and does not replace any NIH policy or guidance, and I am not being compensated in any way today for this presentation. Within my presentation, there is also no off-label use of any type of investigational product or device. So just with disclosures, just kind of looking now at the learning objectives for today. What I'd like to do is just share with you how to understand funding opportunities and just some key points when you're looking at different funding opportunities. I'd also like to go through and identify budget considerations when doing a single center trial. We will touch a little bit on consultants and subcontract agreements, just very briefly, in case you're working with a mentor or an expert from another institution that needs to be considered in the conduct of your trial, as well as developing strategies used in drafting a budget and preparing for submission of a proposal. So when we consider budgeting, I always like to say that budgeting is just balancing what you need with the amount of funds that are available. So you always want to make sure that you're doing a very robust project and that you're getting the data that you need, and you never want to sell yourself short. But many times you're working with funding limitations that need to be considered. So we're going to talk about some of the ways that you can work within some of those constraints. So when we talk about, next slide, please. So when we look at a funding opportunity, we always want to consider, where the funds are coming from. But when we read through the RFA, we want to know if we're working with a capitated amount. So are you working with an award that says that you can't request more than $500,000 a year? Some budgets are what they consider modular, and you can only ask for certain funds to do certain tasks. So you always want to understand what you're able to ask for. The other piece with capitated amounts is that many times this award is capitated. There may be a condition where if you need to exceed that, you can ask for permission to exceed the award amount. This is common with NIH-funded studies, but you always want to make sure that you're applying for the correct amount. And when you want to know also too what can be funded. Many times they will share that a salary in excess of a certain amount cannot be funded. Sometimes with different awards, you can include the cost of an administrative assistant or other administrative personnel in the proposal. Sometimes you cannot. So you always want to know what you're allowed to request in your budget. Another thing, that does the capitated amount include indirect costs? And we'll talk about indirect costs a little later in the presentation. But with indirect costs, if you have for example, if you read an NIH request for a proposal or a funding announcement, and it says your total cost cannot exceed a certain amount, then you need to consider any kind of administrative costs on top of your actual trial cost as part of the total. If you have an announcement that says that your direct cost cannot exceed a certain amount, then your administrative costs are on top of that, and they don't affect your limit. But you always want to read the RFA because different opportunities have different limits on what a total means, whether or not you're including your administrative cost or are you including patient care cost, et cetera. You always want to know if there's any special terms or conditions. If there's any timing before you submit a proposal, if they say you have to have the first deliverable in the first 2 months and you're looking at a project that the deliverable may take a little bit longer, then maybe that opportunity is not for you. I have to say that you always want to know the deadlines. Sometimes they can shift. Some RFAs are not all created the same. Depending on the institution and the funding cycle, they may have different deadlines. And I have to say this as from doing grants is starting early. We always start early, but for some reason we're always pushed up against deadlines. It's not a unique issue. A lot of institutions, especially when things are coming in queue, so you always want to start early. So in case you have any challenges or you need to take a look at something, you always want to make sure that you leave yourself a little bit of room. And especially, trying to turn in something on the last day at 5 o'clock isn't in your best interest because of technical difficulties and such. So next slide, please. So when you're getting started thinking about a budget, you already have this really great idea. You have you understand how it's going to work, but the best thing to do is, I find when creating a budget, is map out, either create a list or a Gantt chart, but map out your subject interactions and interventions. And when we talk about subject interactions, it may not be just when you have the study intervention. There could be screening that you would have to be considering, consenting a subject, and any follow-up visits. So you kind of want to map things out, because that helps you understand your timeline and the amount of resources that you're going to need to engage and for how long. It also helps you understand the timeline of your proposal. Are you turning in a 3-year proposal or a 5-year proposal? So you always want to map out those items. And it's good to see them on paper. I always suggest that people do that, or some kind of visual format, so they can add things. And especially when you're sharing and collaborating, it helps to have a visual. Always involve participating investigators, and I put in bold here and underline, and coordinators in the budgeting conversation. You may not have identified a study coordinator yet to work on your specific project, but if you could pull in the expertise of coordinators, because they may have be thinking of some things that you haven't had an opportunity to consider when you're considering budgeting. There's always institutional expertise. This would be someone from your grants office or your medical school to provide guidance on the proposal or the funding announcement that you're looking at. Also, too, it's always a good idea to let, especially if you have something with a short deadline or a quick turnaround time, it's always good to let people within your institution know that you have a proposal coming. I always share that if you have financing grant persons, a lot of times they are busy, but many times they will take an opportunity to join you for some of your conversations. It may not be, they may not be interested so much in the science or have anything to contribute there, but when you're talking about an intervention, they may have some insight of some cost or some ways that you would need to do stuff that would impact your budget. Another good thing is if you have collaborators or you have colleagues that have same or similar scientific interests, to benchmark with those other persons, either, whether or not within your institution, but it's always a good idea to understand at other institutions as well. So it's always good to reach out. Looking at historical data from previous trials is always helpful. And then the one thing I always share when people are thinking about a budget, even if it's very nascent, is to look at developing a scope of work. Because as you move forward to have conversations, understanding what each person or what you think they would be doing is very helpful, because you may find, for example, that a clinical nurse who you thought would be able to draw blood for you is actually unable to do that, and that would change your scope of work and could affect your budget. So always having an idea for what type of scope of work you would be considering for your budget, it helps you identify the personnel that you're going to need and the resources. So next slide, please. So when we talk about budget considerations, one of the things that we always, right up front think about is personnel. So when we're doing research, there's no such thing really as volunteering your time. There may be some things that you can do in the evening as far as, pre-award work for writing the proposal or getting the idea together. because those costs you can't charge to a grant. But when you actually go to do the study, you always want to do things to protect your time and protect other people's time in order to make your study successful. So when you're looking at personnel, do you have co-investigators? Are there other persons that would, need to help with you with the intervention or help with screening or attend meetings? There's, you need to consider that. There's always things that, that you're going to want them to be able to have, time for you to do. And the best way is consider them in your budget. Study team members, again, other investigators, even if they aren't co-investigators, people that may be helping you to recruit subjects, they need to be considered in their time. Study coordinators, there's different ways to cover the time and the effort for study coordinators. There's a lot of different models. Some groups share coordinators. Some groups have a central bank of coordinators. But you always want to think about the persons that are out there looking for subjects and helping you screen. Research assistants, if you have people in the lab, research assistants covers a broad area. They can be people that enter data or do data abstraction. Some research assistants, it may be a grad student or someone within your statistical group that's going to be working on some of the data analyses. Depending on their level, they may be a co-investigator, but many groups bring in students or grad students to help with that. And then budget personnel for your financial oversight. When you have funds coming in, even if they're departmental funds, someone needs to be keeping an eye on those and helping you reconcile accounts and reconciling effort. Many times those they may not need to be in your budget, but they need to be considered in the cost of the study. And it may be that your institution is willing to cover their salary and support, or it may be that you're allowed to budget them in your grant. So another thing when we talk about budgeting is what I alluded to initially is that clinical care staff, depending on your institution, nurses may or may not be able to grab research blood samples for you, or if you are using, let's say, an approved medication, but you're doing, something in a certain way and you need vitals at a certain time, they may be at the bedside, but having them gather information or data for you for research purposes may not be allowable. Some institutions have nursing recharge fees. So when you're thinking about people that are involved clinically with your intervention, if you're counting on them to do a critical part of the work, it may not be a lot, but it may be something that's really important to your study. Having them defined on your scope of work or understanding what they'll need to do will help you with their budgeting. And again, when you have someone like that with the clinical staff, you want to, your institution can share with you if there's any special considerations, like, for example, I put their union rules that's come up for a lot of different groups at different sites because what their nurses can do and how they can be compensated. So again, clinical care staff, if it's for research, you maybe have a whole different consideration than you would if they were just at the bedside caring for the patient. And then consultants. Our consultants, are they truly consultants? So many times we may call a collaborator a consultant, but if you have a collaborator who's at your institution and they are doing something that's not too far from what they would do during the day, I put his or her day job. If it's not severable completely from what they do and they're within your institution, you may not be able to consider them a consultant. They may just be part of the work scope because, again, consultants have to, their work is severable from what they're doing usually during the day. The other part is institutions. Some institutions don't allow some of their clinical staff to be consultants under certain conditions, so you're always going to want to tease those out. And then are they contributing in a certain way that if it's effort-based, that do they have the effort to give? And that's probably a whole other discussion of effort reporting, but you can't cover someone's time as a consultant if indeed it's really effort-based. And when we talk about determining what they're doing as consultants, we'll touch on that briefly a little bit later in the presentation. But consultants are something that needs to be considered exactly what they're doing for your project in the work scope. Next slide, please. So just a couple things, broad things when we're talking about personnel. Be conservative when you're multitasking staff. If you're in a department that has a really great coordinator, or you're working with an investigator who has a couple coordinators, and that person offers to have their coordinator screen for subjects for you while they're already there, that may seem like a great opportunity, especially if it's departmentally funded. But if something would change within your institution, or the person that's working with you decides to leave and all of a sudden that goes away, then you have a really need that you haven't considered in your budget. So we always want to be fiscally conservative, but just be really conservative when you consider multitasking staff. The other piece of that is too, is if you have someone that's working on a grant, they can't really work on someone else's grant. So there's no borrowing or, having someone just help out. Again, there's no volunteerism when it comes to that. So just be conservative when someone's offering. It's always best to consider a staff member's time, then look for someone who's kind of offering something. There's a little difference between that and cost sharing. We'll touch base on that a little bit, but just always budget for the persons you need. Also, too, don't forget about fringe benefits. A lot of times people will find out a person's salary and they'll include that amount in the budget. But when they look at the salary number, for example, someone may ask, hey, if you don't mind, how much do you make? I'd like to write you into my proposal. But then they don't find out how much the person's fringe benefits are. Depending, at most institutions, the average is anywhere from 30 to 36% for fringe benefits. Depending on the locale, again, that can be a little bit higher. Sometimes for investigators, that might be a little bit lower, but you always need to consider fringe benefits because those are direct costs that will affect your limit in the budget. And you'll be surprised how fast those can sneak up on you. When you're also too, if you have personnel, if you're collaborating, that again, this is where you refer to your work scope. You always look for duplication and see if there's any duplication that can be eliminated. When you're putting it together, your proposal, not only from a budget standpoint, but also from a grantsmanship standpoint, you don't want to have a lot of people listed as doing the same thing. And then administrative staff, like an administrative assistant or a financial manager, may or may not be allowed on a certain type of an award. Some foundation awards allow you to put administrative staff. Some project grants or center grants allow you to put administrative staff. But you want to be careful with that too, about administrative staff. So if you plan on having your administrative person do a lot of work for you, you just always want to make sure the difference, tease out the difference between a coordinator and an administrative person. Next slide, please. So patient care costs, this is somewhere where it gets a little confusing, and this is a place where I always suggest that people contact their institution. Here at the University of Michigan, we have a group that looks at whether or not an intervention is standard of care or whether or not an investigational product is standard of care. When I use the term investigational product, that's a broader word for any kind of drug or any kind of device you may be using. So in this circumstance, aspirin could be considered an investigational product. It's not a medication under an IND or any type of federal oversight. But anytime you have an investigational product or a medication, it could be an antihypertensive medication, it could be a coagulation reversal agent, it could be anything like that, but investigational product. So if you have an item and you think, well, we give the patient that anyway, it's always good to have your institution look and determine whether or not that's standard of care, to be able to explain that, because it may be a cost that ends up getting recharged to the study, and you don't want to find out later on that your investigational product is actually something that you would have to pay for out of your trial. Relabeling, a lot of people don't relabel, but for example, if you wanted to blind a medication, you may have a medication and when it's going through IV tubing, it has a color that you want to mask. You may have to purchase things to help with, that or relabeling of an investigational product. We used, for one of our studies, we used a standard approved medication, but we had the medication relabeled, and that was a significant cost because you can't just put a piece of tape or a label over a medication that's being injected. There's certain things that you need to do in order to make sure that before it can be given to a patient. So you always want to make sure that you're considering those costs for investigational product. The same line of thinking goes for tests and interventions. CAT scans is one that comes up. A lot of times people have a CAT scan, and well, it would make sense. We'd probably get a CAT scan at this point, but that may be considered a research intervention, not standard of care. So you're going to want to work with your institution to understand what's standard of care with patient care cost and what is actually something that is more research related and billable to the study. Another item in a budget consideration is subject reimbursements when we think about patients. I put a little warning sign there for things that, takeaway points that would probably need to be considered by an outside body. But when you look at subject reimbursements, it's completely reasonable to reimburse a person who chooses to participate in your study for their time and their costs. And those costs can be real. Time out of work, driving, parking, if they're going to be there for different tests. They may have to partake of a meal while they're waiting for some of the tests. So people have real costs associated with that. What you want to do is you want to have, think about what costs, again, such as parking and gas and mileage, would be part of the per subject payment, because you don't want to put a payment that is high enough where it would look like you're trying to coax or be coercive in any way to get the person to participate in your study. With subject reimbursements, we have respect for our subjects and we need to reimburse their time and their expenses. So you want to be considerate of that when you're considering a budget. Next slide, please. Other things that kind of creep in your budget and, big surprises, services. So, for example, laboratory space, your department may have lab space that is available to you, but there's actually a square footage fee that you aren't aware of until you consider doing research in that space. Specimen collection and storage. Different institutions have different rules about who can collect a tube of blood. In some institutions, a coordinator can come with a tube of blood and request a nurse or patient care personnel grab the tube of, obtain the blood sample for them and handle it. Other institutions, it has to be someone who's certified in research from a laboratory, and they have a laboratory cost for drawing a tube of blood. So you want to make sure that you're considering those costs for your institution. Storage, some researchers are allowed to, if they have a freezer or they have a freezer in their lab, they're allowed to store research samples there. Other institutions, it needs to be kept in a centralized research fridge, and it has a fee. So you always want to be aware of any type of fees they would have. IT charges, those are creeping into a lot of budgets where computer charges and IT charges, they're not that high, but you don't want to find out afterwards that you have an IT charge. Investigational product services, again, you may have a medication, it's not under study, but it has to be handled by someone in your institution. So they could have a charge to receive the product, they could have a charge to restock it into a Pyxis, and they could charge for accountability and tracking. So you want to be aware of those. Application fees, many institutions waive the cost of IRB reviews for federally funded studies, but if it's for a foundation, they may still creep in with the application fee. If you're using a central IRB, then they have application fees, as well as there may be a fee for an amendment. So you want to tease those out ahead of time when you're putting in your proposal. Next slide, please. Supplies, those are pretty self-explanatory. You know, you want to think about any binders or glassware. Your institution may have, again, tubes of blood. You see them laying around, but when you want to use them for your research, you know, there's a cost for those. So you want to make sure that you're looking to budget those in. Computers, a lot of times some of us have computers, but if they're using it for a study, for example, if you have someone who's going off-site and getting data from a subject, it may not be reasonable for them to take a desktop machine with them. So a laptop or a purchase like that may be appropriate. And then office supplies and gifts and postage, those items I have there, a little mark there. Sometimes those things are allowable, not the gifts, but it depends on what it's being used for, the type of research you're doing. You may be doing some social research or doing some type of thing where, you know, providing an incentive or, you know, is appropriate. But for office supplies and postage, that's usually if you're doing like sending out a lot of surveys or printing out patient diaries for subjects to take home, you can charge those. But otherwise, office supplies are just the cost of doing business, and they're recovered in facilities administrative costs. And then equipment is classified as anything over $5,000, freezers, giant microscopes, those type of things. But if you're going to need those that would probably come to the forefront. But you'd want to make sure you got a competitive bid for those. Next slide, please. Travel. If you're doing a single center study, you may not have a lot of travel. But if you're working with a sponsor, or you have a collaborator with specific expertise, they may need to travel for meetings. I know we try to do everything without getting on a plane, but we always want to consider travel. Another piece of travel that's coming in more frequently is that a lot of our study personnel are going to meet with the subject outside of an office or a clinical setting. So if you have coordinators are going to be going to, for example, an extended care facility to gather data or meet with the subject to do a neurological test off-site, you're going to need to cover their travel for that. And when we talk about travel, it's usually we budget for mileage and parking. Meals as part of travel, if someone's traveling overnight. We've had studies where a subject has moved out of state, but a physical exam needs to be conducted, and there's no way to do it online, so someone would need to travel there. So you want to consider those things when you're talking about travel for not only your study staff, but if you're going to a meeting. And those things are allowable. One thing that's just coming up is that if you are going to have travel internet charges while you're traveling, make sure to include those in your budget justification, because those are coming up as items that might flag in an audit or be questioned as an allowable charge. Next slide, please. Another thing to budget, if you're going to be doing a lot of calls and things, is toll calls. You can't charge in a typical budget for making long-distance phone calls, but if you're having conference calls or you're having calls with subjects, those may be allowable to a grant. Meeting expenses, if you're meeting on your campus, then usually you don't have these type of expenses, but if you're having a larger meeting or an offsite meeting, you may need to budget for them. And then you need to find out which parts of those are allowable charges. And then space, if you have an exam or a follow-up visit that isn't appropriate to be conducted in an office or not allowed, then you may need to budget or consider fees for using clinic rooms or off-site rooms. And then alterations and renovations to buildings, that's very, very rare, but it is something that, depending on the type of study you're doing, you may need to ask for. Again, it's extremely rare. Next slide, please. So the other part of budgeting is facilities and administrative costs. Facilities and administrative costs are also known as indirect costs. They are the real cost of doing business at an institution. So they're they help with things like paying for administrative costs. They may pay for the space that you don't have to budget for in your grant. They pay for lights in your lab. They pay for heat in your lab. So they are real costs of doing research at an institution. Those are, when we talk about it, facilities administrative costs, like the lights, you can't attribute it or energy use to a specific project. Or sometimes if there's just a secretary or someone in the front of the clinic who's answering phones from subjects, those aren't something that's exactly attributed to the project. Usually they do not apply to patient care costs. So if you have, if you're doing a CAT scan, you do not have to assess facilities administrative costs to that activity. But again, each funding agency and each situation is different, so you always want to follow up. And facilities and administrative costs can vary between institutions, awards, and funders. So when your institution, for example, here at the University of Michigan, we have a research rate that's 55%, but we also have an off-campus rate that's 29%, or pardon me, not off-campus, pardon me, other sponsored activities rate that's 29%. Then we also have an off-campus rate. So what's important about that is if you're doing a CAT scan, you do not have to. Okay. Okay. I think someone just came off mute, but that's okay. The other part that's important about that is your scope of work. When your institution looks at what F&A recovery, they'll look at your scope of work because that determines what percent from what funder you have. So when we talked at the beginning of the presentation about the total cost versus the direct cost, if you have total cost to consider in your limitation for the budget, your F&A costs need to be considered. If you're looking at direct costs, these don't, as a capitation, these don't come into play because they are different than your direct costs, the F&A costs are, but they're always something that you need to be aware of and be applied to the budget when you're packaging the proposal. Next slide, please. So just real quickly, when we're thinking again about the type of, when I say an agreement that you're working with within your institution, so if you have another investigator that's working with you at your institution, that's what we call a cost reimbursable type of agreement, and it's an interinstitutional agreement. You can also have cost reimbursable agreements with people outside your institution. So if this would be the type of agreement you would have with someone who's providing expertise and has effort on your project who's not at your place of where you're conducting the study. There's also vendor agreements, and vendor agreements can be maybe you're sending your samples off for genotyping off at an off-site lab. Those are considered vendor agreements. Consultants, they're spending time on your project, but they're also considered vendors. I know some people don't like being called vendors when they're consultants, but it's a type of agreement, and it affects how the agreement's treated, the type of contract that's sent to the person or the institution or company that's doing the work, and it also affects the deliverables. And this acronym here, CRO, Contract Research Organization, you may be at an institution where you choose not to hire a coordinator. Maybe you're going to contract with some organization to do some type of project management for you or help you with an investigational new device application or new drug application. So those were the type, that'd be like a type of agreement that's a vendor agreement. In hybrid agreements, those are per subject payments. Usually you don't use those interinstitutionally, but if more and more groups are looking at being reimbursed after enrollment, so those may go interinstitutional. So you may have, for example, you're doing the study, but you're going to give another department $3,000 for every subject that they enroll or every subject that they do some type of follow-up for you. So that's a hybrid, but most of the time when you're doing a single center study, you're going to be working with cost reimbursable and or vendor agreements. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go over every single bullet point here, but when we're talking about subcontracts with other institutions, or when someone's trying to maybe subcontract with you, there's 5 criteria that have to be met, and all of these 5 criteria have to be met in order to be considered a subcontract. Otherwise, they may be a vendor agreement, or they may fall into the hybrid category. Again, we won't go into these in depth because this is a whole different this is a whole separate conversation. But I just wanted you to have this information here when you're looking at trying to determine whether or not the person you're working with, if they're outside your institution, is actually a subcontract, or whether or not they should be considered a consultant. Next slide, please. Really quickly, when you're talking about how you're going to, what people are, with whether or not they're a consultant or they're a vendor, just a real quick algorithm. If the relationship meets the criteria, they're a subcontract. If it's different, if it doesn't, then will they be following a reimbursement strategy, or are they being, is this their primary course of business? So for example, if it's a laboratory, then that's what they do, and they may be considered a vendor agreement. Or if they're a consultant that does specific work as a freelance consultant, then they're a vendor agreement. So this will help determine that. And then the next slide, please. Again, why that's important is that depending when you're looking at when you're putting your proposal together, if it's a capitated amount, if a person is a cost reimbursable agreement, then your F&A, let's just use a nice number of 10%, they assess that on the first $25,000. And then after the person or the effort is covered at $25,000, the institution no longer assesses F&A, and then you don't need to consider it. If it's a vendor agreement and you're paying a consultant $50,000, then every dollar of the $50,000 would have a 10% assessment. So again, that's really, really important when you're dealing with limitations and capitations to determine what you can pay. Also, too, with some agreements, with the uniform guidance, they don't want you to pay any. One of the notes in there is that is paying any one vendor over $175,000 requires certain permissions and review. So you always want to look at what type of agreements you have and how things are being treated, because it does affect allowability and how the F&A costs are assessed, which impacts your budget. And then hybrid, it depends. Hybrid agreements are a little bit different. Again, if this is a conversation about subcontracting, we get a little bit deeper into that, but I just want you to be aware that it is out there in case someone uses the term. Next slide, please. So when you want to package your proposal, whether or not you're turning it into a foundation or a federal sponsor, or many institutions have internal funding opportunities, you always want to kind of look at how you're going to package it. So look at the different reimbursement strategies that you want to use for your study. Do you have consultants? Are you using a cost reimbursable model, for example? Are you going to share a coordinator? You want to understand, what you can do to, make it the most cost efficient, yet get the results that you need for your study. Another thing is what the collaborators are doing for the trial. You want to make sure that the amount you budgeted is correct and correlates well with what they'll be doing. If someone, if they really aren't going to be doing that much and you're finding you're up against a limitation or a cap, there may be some things that you can work out with the person in order to make sure you meet the limits. Providing set funds for a coordinator, again, or leaving it as a milestone. That may be where you're paying for 1% of a coordinator in another department, or maybe you're just giving another department a certain amount of funds for different activity that's conducted. Will your department or your medical school consider alternate forms of facilities and administrative recovery? So for as an example, within the net, with our first funding cycle, our medical school waived F&A recovery on subcontracts, which was very helpful because it helped us keep our total costs down. But you have to work those agreements out with your institution. That was a very unique circumstance, but some institutions will consider a lower rate or a research rate or other sponsored activities rate. One thing that you need to be careful with rates is, like I had shared at the beginning of the presentation, or a little earlier in the presentation, they're not all the same. So if you have, for example, a training grant, your F&A recovery may only be 8%. And when it reads 8%, your institution, if they submit the proposal, they're agreeing to taking the 8%. Whereas other sponsored activity that would normally be 29, if you just want to say, well, I'm trying to keep my cost down, so I'm going to apply 8, that's a discussion that you need to have with them. When we talk about, is your institution willing to cost share? Cost share gets us back into the conversation of, is your department or your institution making the commitment to give you a certain resource? So are they going to say that we'll give you 50% of a research coordinator to conduct this work? So a cost share isn't just a gentleman's agreement. A cost share is written into a letter of support or written into the budget justification of your proposal that commits that resource to your proposal. Those are always good. You know, I mean, we're all, you know, to get things in writing, we're all pretty savvy when it comes to getting things in writing. But when you do that, it's considered cost share. And then if you do have travel, paying from the central award. So for example, if you have, if you budget for travel and your collaborator for someone to come to your institution and you find that you're able to telecommute, are the dollars already in your budget, or have the dollars been sent to this person's institution for travel? So sometimes keeping travel in a central award, if you're able to do that, it helps control costs and just helps if you do get into a situation where you need to request rebudgeting. It's, you know, it's always kind of, we try to put that there in case we need to shift a little bit, but it's something to consider when you're packaging your proposal. Next slide, please. So I can, my final takeaway from this is always get input. If there's something that you don't understand or you need guidance on, always ask, because it's so much easier to ask up front than it is to ask later. This may be for the regulatory pieces or working with your medical school. The other part is that we work with a lot of smart, knowledgeable people, but your situation may be very unique. And so the person's advice to you may be coming from their own experience. So I say get input. And then I like this cartoon because it's, you know, we all agree, now let's go back and discuss why it won't work. This is when we not only take the enthusiastic critique of our work or what our plans are, but also look at any concerns or hesitations that someone else brings up and, you know, put that in, you know, up front, because you always want to make sure you're considering those type of things in your budget before you go forward. Next slide, please. Just a couple links for some helpful hints here. The NIH grants policy, that is your go-to guide for any NIH grants. The uniform guidance, that is the new guidelines for allowability. They used to call like A21 with things you couldn't purchase, for example, putting pens on a grant. Now the uniform guidance is a little bit broader and it has a lot of changes in it. And then the one thing that's fun here is for studies, if you're trying to create an acronym for your studies, there's this link that helps you create, you know, catchy acronyms. I just think that's a fun link. So next slide, please. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. I'd just like to open it up from questions from the group.
So everyone, if you'd like to be made a presenter so that you can ask a question verbally, there's a request to interact live button on the right-hand side of your screen. Alternatively, you can enter a question in the chat, event chat, for the presenter to answer. Your presentation was great, Val. Looks like there aren't any questions so far. Well, since we're close to the 1 o'clock stop time, I wanted to just give a little information about CMEs. Please complete the evaluation form, especially if you're interested in CMEs. You can click the link in the event chat, and you'll be taken to the form, or you can also copy and paste the link that we'll put up in a second into your toolbar search to complete the evaluation. The next webinar will be on Friday, September 9th at noon. Actually, it looks like there's a question from Araya Puwanat. The question is, when we are budgeting for a laptop, does it need to be exclusively used for the proposed study only?
You know, that's a great question. So in the uniform guidance, there is specific language about the use of computers. In the previous A21, when you had a computer, it had to be used specifically for study-related activities. Now the uniform guidance is has a different language that's a little broader, that has a little bit more allowability for the use of a computer. But if you're using a computer and you really don't have any study-specific use for a computer, like gathering data or analyzing data or participating in different types of meetings and stuff, then it's something that you probably should not have in your budget.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Okay. As I mentioned, if you go to the event chat and click on the link, you'll be able to go to the evaluation form. You can also send us questions at NINDS-CTMC-info@umich.edu if you have any additional questions, and you can also visit the course website. So thank you again to our speaker, and thank you all for your patience through the technical difficulties earlier on, and we hope to see you in September for the next webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for coming.